the Stones really affected me very, very deeply. Their wildness on the stage, the fact that they didn't wear uniforms, this kind of thing was very just outrageous, you know. And Jagger's stage performance and Keith Richards' stage performance, just very, very wild and unkempt. And they were the first, I think the closest to sort of a latter-day punk image. But I don't know, you know, how many American kids really know what happened in London with the punk bands. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, did you go to a concert, for example? Have you ever been to a punk concert in Britain?
No, I haven't. Not in
well,
Britain.
they were crazy.
You're talking about back in the early 60s now?
No, I'm talking about this recent
thing.
Recent yeah. You know, what I'm saying really is to actually compare a band like The Who, you know, at any stage of their career, to what the punks were doing it's impossible, really, because the punks were just a really total anarchy. The audience and the bands, it was a completely anarchistic, not destructive, it was just completely outrageously free. And of course the Who's music was never like that. I mean, we used to break up a few instruments and now and again, and we used to play, I mean, particularly Keith's style was very loose and loud, and my style was very heavy, but you know, there were a lot of bands playing that kind of music at the times. The early Kinks were pretty raucous outfit, and the band that Eric used to play with, the Yardbirds, I mean, they were a pretty outrageous outfit as well. I mean, sound-wise.
Do you think that this recent anarchistic punk rock and roll became so popular in England but never really happened in the United States was because the rock and roll generation of a few years ago, the environment they came out of in England was so different from the environment that they came out of the United States? Working class kids in England as opposed to working class kids in America.
I think it's a cultural difference, obviously, but I think it's the only music, the only rock music that I've heard for a long, long time, which has got nothing to do with any roots whatsoever.
Do you think it's musically it's got some validity?
Oh yeah, I mean, there were some great albums. I mean, my favourite album of the period was the Sex Pistols album, which was produced by Chris Thomas. That Never Mind the Bollocks is the Sex
first
Pistols.
album of theirs.
And I think Pretty Vacant, that track on it, you know, we're so pretty vacant, you know. I think it's like a modern My Generation, really. It's not as obvious as My Generation, but it's the same kind of thing. But the amazing thing is that the concerts were so hectic, so violent, and particularly in the first 6 months of the thing, when bands like the Clash and the Vibrators and the Sex Pistols and various... I mean, the Sex Pistols couldn't actually play in public. I mean, it was that bad. They had to play unannounced concerts. Consequently, there's very, very few people who ever saw them appear. I never saw them appear. But I saw several other bands. Yeah, I used to go to clubs and stand and get insulted. Just stand there and endure these snotty-nosed little kids coming out saying, "Boring old fart, boring old fart."
Do you think that taking in the whole rock and roll picture, that the music that you're talking about now and the violence turned off so many people that maybe it kind of started to put a nail in the rock and roll coffin?
No, I reckon what happened, why punk went into such a rapid demise, or never ever got going, was precisely because they had no roots. Bands like The Who and the Stones, as I've said before, for fear of repeating myself, I mean, we had very strong roots in R&B, but they were wider than that too. I mean, when I was 17, I used to listen to and try to bring out in my music jazz. I used to listen to Coltrane, Charlie Parker, early Herbie Hancock, people like that. And so we had a very strong... It's like building a mountain and then taking off. Whereas what the punks wanted to do is they wanted to clear everything out of the way. They felt that the establishment, the rock establishment, was too powerful, too gross, that the people that controlled it were too old, too out of touch, that the superstars like The Who and the Stones and Yes and Genesis and people like this were far too...
artsy, maybe?
No, too technocratic.
Mm-hmm.
That their concerts were unwieldy and too expensive, and that club performances had practically disappeared. Mm-hmm. Bands had to pay, and still do in Britain, to appear with a major act. They call it tour support. Mm. You actually have to pay, if you're a small band and you want to tour with, say, I don't know, an up-and-coming group, or say like The Who, the supporting bands are expected to share the expenses, which, let's face it, are established by the major act, not by the supporting group. I mean, if The Who go on, we take lasers and enormous lighting stacks and 54 road crew, etc., etc., etc. And if somebody wants to tour with us, they're expected not necessarily to pay us for the privilege of playing, but certainly to share some of the expenses. And I think all these factors, and the fact that it was easy money for the record companies too, to sit on their laurels and work with established acts. And it's quite interesting talking to people in the States now, particularly people who are in control of the big record companies, who are saying, listen, there's no recession. There is no record recession. What is actually happening is there's no new music. And we've got to get off our asses and find
Do you think that's
the new
so?
American music.
Do you think that's so?
Well, who's new in America? The Cars and the Knack. And with the greatest respect to two very, very fine bands, they've both been around a long time. You know, I know the guy, I've known the guy in the Knack since he was 16.
So do you think that that rock and roll is in a place now where it has to get some kind of new blood and rejuvenation and new ideas and new thoughts? Do you think it's kind of feeding off itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps any new or any American musician who's thinking of putting a band together could actually take a lesson, though, from the way that the punks manipulated the press and the record companies, because it was brilliantly done. But they should also take a lesson from the fact that obviously you can't lay waste to everything and then expect to be able to build from there. You have to build from somewhere, and of course the more you've got behind you, the better. I mean, I'm talking about musical roots, really, because musical evolution is so slow. The Who have been in existence now for 16 years as a performing outfit, and we still go on stage and we play that old stuff, and we still play bits of Tommy, and sometimes people say, oh, you're wallowing in nostalgia. It's not nostalgia for us, it is what we are.